start?
Yes, please.
Yes. All right. So good evening to everyone who joined us in America, and good morning to those of you who join us from China. I'm Patty Li, Director of the Confucius Institute at Webster University. So welcome to the China Urban Study Author Talk Series organized by our institute together with the Chinese and Comparative Study Association. This talk series aims at creating a new platform for international scholarly exchange in this virtual world and introducing to scholars and general public the newly explored aspect in the field of China urban studies. Today, we are honored to have Professor Steve Hochstadt, who will speak about his book, Exodus to Shanghai, Story of Escape from the Third Reich. Dr. Hochstadt is a professor emeritus of history at Illinois College. And he has done extensive research on Jewish refugees who fled to Shanghai and wrote several books about the Holocaust, especially about Jewish refugees in China. And his Viennese grandparents survived the Holocaust by fleeing to Shanghai. So he grew up with mementos of their lives, their years in China. Besides teaching and research, he holds the position of treasurer at the Sino-Judaic Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes cooperation in matters of mutual historic and cultural interest between Chinese and the Jewish people. So today's talk will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Warren Rosenbaum, history professor at Webster University. He's the author of Beyond the Prison Gates, Punishment and Warfare in Germany, 1850 to 1933. This book won the Baker Button Prize of the Southern Historical Association. And he serves on the executive committee of the Holocaust Museum and the Learning Center in St. Louis, and is a fellow of the Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Webster University. Professor Rosenbaum will be a Fulbright research and teaching fellow at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium this spring. Congratulations. Thanks for him for joining us while taking the valuable sabbatical leave this semester. So before I give floor to our two great historians here, I'd like to extend my thanks to my colleagues and friends at Webster University for your strong support. And also to Professor Kang Ling from Fudan University in Shanghai and Dr. Wang Yu from University of Macau. They provided invaluable book recommendations and also share their broad scholarly connection. So many thanks to each of you. So now I'm going to invite Professor Rosenbaum to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Patty. And thank you for organizing this event and giving me the opportunity to read Stephen's really wonderful book and having this chance to talk with what sounds like a very international and very interesting audience. I wish I could see everybody. Unfortunately, I can't, but it's great to know that you're all out there. So Stephen, thank you for writing this book and for all the work. It seems like it must have been a real labor of love. Doing oral history means, I guess, that since this was pre-pandemic, that you got out and met all these people face to face, and it must have just, that in itself, because their personalities really come across in the book, it must have been interesting doing history that way, because I know that, like me, you're a historian trained in the old school with dry documents and libraries and all that stuff. So maybe we could just start by you saying a few things about what got you interested in the idea of doing oral history, and specifically oral history on the topic of the Jewish exodus to Shanghai.
Well, thanks, Warren, and thanks to Patty and everyone at Webster who is organizing this. So I have to start at the beginning. I'm a historian. And the beginning is, this is a childhood friend of mine. It and other items like it were on the shelves in my house when I grew up. So I've known about Shanghai and Jews in Shanghai and my relatives in Shanghai since I've known anything at all. But that didn't get me any place for quite a long time. As Warren said, I became a historian. As Patty said, I wrote about the Holocaust. I was writing about the Holocaust. I was not thinking about Shanghai as a project. But my grandmother, who was still alive and who had been in Shanghai, is a good storyteller. And I wanted to ask her, in the guise of family history, about what she did in Shanghai, what her life was in Shanghai. And I took a tape recorder and I made a couple recordings of her in the late 1980s. And that was going to be it. But she was so interesting. And I found out she lived in Southern California at the time. My parents lived in Southern California. There's a lot of Jews in Southern California. There are a lot of Jews who were in Shanghai there. Not quite as many as in San Francisco, but probably more than anywhere else. And so I met some other people and I did another interview. And then I did another interview, and it was so much fun. That's what you were saying, Warren. I was not trained to do that. I had to read books. I had to just go on my gut. But once I started doing interviews, I wanted to do more interviews. And I did not know where I was going. So I'm looking at some notes here. Then an opportunity fell into my lap. And this is also what happens to historians, I think. An opportunity to go to Shanghai with former residents of Shanghai in 1989 to celebrate a Seder. In maybe the first Seder in Shanghai since in 40 years. And so I signed up for this trip. There were going to be hundreds of former Shanghai residents. That's what I was told. There were 8, but it was wonderful. I interviewed all of them in Shanghai, and that really propelled me to think that this is a project. This is an academic or an intellectual or a scholarly project, and it's also a project that's so much fun listening to these people who were in Shanghai, that I did more. And so I'm looking down here. In 1989, I interviewed 14 people. In 1990, I interviewed 19 people. In 1991, I interviewed 15. And in 1994, 95, my wife and I went to Germany with students, and we spent a year in Germany, and I interviewed 34 people in Germany and Austria then. So by that time, 1994, this was a big project, but I didn't know what I was going to do exactly. Now I want to do a little show and tell. In 1994, 2 books, the first 2 popular books about Jews in Shanghai came out. So this is one of them, Shanghai Refuge, by a man named Ernst Heppner. This, I think, this is the first, but it's also the best memoir by a Shanghaier, a Shanghai Jew that I've read. And this came out in 1994. At the same time, this book, Escape to Shanghai, by James Ross, I don't know if you can see his name, James Ross, who, more like me, is an academic who got interested and who did some interviews. And this book is made up of interviews with 4 people that he interviewed extensively. So by this time, I've done a lot of interviews. There is this idea maybe of putting together a book of interviews rather than writing a normal history book where it's my voice dealing with all the evidence. And so eventually, and I can't pinpoint a date, but eventually I decided that this was going to be a book of interviews. I was going to use the interviews. And the absolutely most important thing that led to that decision was that I thought what these people were telling me was so interesting, not just in what they experienced, but in how they told it, that I thought their words are way more interesting than anything I could write, and more revealing about what went on in Shanghai and how they felt about it, and what was important to them. So I decided so that helped me decide most of the words in this book. So here it is. Most of the words in this book are theirs. All historians quote from people, so there's nothing unusual about quoting from people, but it is unusual for the historian to step back almost entirely and let his sources speak for themselves. This actually got in my way when I wanted to publish the book. Academic presses, where are you? They want, where are you? We want you to write more. No, I don't want to write more. Why were these people so interesting? I don't think just being a refugee automatically makes you more interesting, although it certainly might work that way. I don't think just being in Shanghai, but all of these people that I spoke to had been in Europe, had been in China, and had either gone back to Europe or had been in Israel and then gone to Europe or had come to the United States, all the world, and made them interesting people to talk with really broad thinking. That was, so that's why I decided to do that.
Yeah.
Now, Warren, you could ask a question, or I could say more about how I got 100 interviews into a book.
Yeah. Well, we did have actually in advance, we had one interesting question from Ruth McBrayer, who asked specifically how you decided, in fact, given that you had such a rich offering, what were your criteria ultimately of selection? How did you make the decision on what should go into a book like this?
Part of that is sort of normal intellectual decision making, and part of it is because of the coincidences of trying to get published. So I'll say something about that. So I did 100 interviews by the time I was done, by the time I was putting together this book, and I knew that was too many. I couldn't introduce 100 people or 50 or 30. But I thought I could introduce a dozen people so that if they spoke in print, and then some other people spoke, and then they spoke again, and later again, you would get to know these 12 people. 12 might have been the upper limit, but that's the way I thought about it. I wanted them to become personalities that became familiar by the end of the book. And that was also partly the way I decided to put it together, not a whole interview together, but there's a chapter about being in Europe, in Germany, and then there's a chapter about going to Shanghai and a chapter about getting to Shanghai, etc. And so each person appears in each of these chapters. And that way I thought, say something about the Shanghai experience. That is, you'd hear 12 versions of a certain experience and you'd get to know that experience, but you'd also still get to know the individual people as they experience these things. That was my goal. In order to do that, I needed interviews where the whole range of experience, from being in Europe before Shanghai to being wherever they left Shanghai for. People who talked about that whole experience, and not everybody did. I remember a number of interviews where I would sit down with a person in their living room. We just met. I would say, I want you, I'm here because I'm interested in your experience in Shanghai. And the person I was talking to would start in Shanghai, and we'd never hear a word about anything before. That was fine as an interview, but it wouldn't work in this book. So I wanted people who did everything. I wanted good storytellers. Not everybody is a good storyteller. I hope that those of us who are in the teaching profession are good storytellers. Many people that I spoke to were good storytellers, but some weren't. And so I wanted to pick out the best ones. And then came this problem that I was having with finding a publisher who was willing to publish a book like this book. And I had done most of my interviews in English, but a significant number in German. Purposely, because I said to people, I want you to speak the language you're most comfortable with. And for many of them, it was German. And for those who were back in Germany and Austria, it was certainly German. And that was much better than asking them to speak in English, which they all could anyway. Anyone who was in Shanghai could speak some English, and they all could speak English. So I had these German interviews and I had these English interviews. I don't believe in translation. Of course, I don't believe in translating people's interviews, because then it's my voice or the translator's voice. It's not their voice. So I didn't want to translate German interviews into English. And I was successful eventually in finding a publisher for my German interviews. And so the first book that I put together was of interviews in German. And they were all with people who were back in Europe, Germany and Austria. And maybe later we'll come to that, because that's interesting. Then this book that I showed you, Exodus to Shanghai, is actually my second try at this, where now I had put together a book. I had seen how it worked. I had seen how the flow worked from one chapter to another. And now I just did it with other interviews in English of people who were now all in America. And I regretted, just to finish up about how did I regretted not being able to put certain people in.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very happy about everybody that I put in.
Yeah, yeah. Part of what's so interesting about this story is that China is not where these folks wanted to go. I mean, some of them didn't want to leave Germany at all. They were very sad to leave the country that they thought of as theirs, Germany or Austria. And certainly the ones that knew they had to leave, they wanted to go to United States. They wanted to go to their family members in Cuba. They wanted to go to other various places that would have been more familiar to them linguistically and culturally. But no, they end up in China. And that gives your book a little bit of a tension, really, in a way, because, you know, the good news is you've made it out of Germany. The bad news is you didn't go where you wanted to go. And so I guess wondered about if you could say a few things about that that moment, you know, of ending up in China, both in terms of, you know, the good news that they made it out and what a challenge that was, and what they must have been feeling, and on the other hand, frankly, what your book is very blunt about, which was their kind of shock and their disappointment at being in a place that they really didn't feel at all at home in, at least at first.
When I first went to China in 1989, I was shocked. China was different, just looked different in every way than Europe and America. And when these refugees arrived in Shanghai, it was much more of a shock to them. And just as you say, Shanghai was not a place they wanted to go. And that explains a lot about the kinds of people who went. So Lisa Johnson, I don't know if you had thought about this already, but Lisa Johnson asked this question about the fact that I had written that the migration to Shanghai was the flight of little people. And it's exactly because nobody, virtually nobody, wanted to go to Shanghai. So if people with resources, people with connections, people with any kind of international renown, people who were able to think, I want to leave in 1934 or 1935, they were able to go to places that were like the United States or England or other places that were difficult to get into, but nevertheless possible for people with connections. And people didn't go to Shanghai. Refugees did not leave Germany and not Austria, certainly it was still free, to go to Shanghai in 33 or 34 or 35, only when things became really desperate after the Anschluss in 38 and Kristallnacht in 38. That's when, okay, we can go to Shanghai. We don't want to go to Shanghai, but we can go to Shanghai and we'll be saved. And so those were people who had waited. And I don't mean by waiting that they were somehow neglectful of their own security, but they had reasons to wait. And then Shanghai was the only place where it was very easy to get to. And so these people were there in Shanghai without preparation, no Chinese, no knowledge of China, no knowledge of even Chinese food. So they were thrown into a totally unfamiliar environment for which they were not well prepared.
Why was it so easy? I mean, why? Because one of your interviewees described just the incredibly complicated bureaucratic process of trying to get any sort of exit visa, standing in line forever, getting up there and finding out that you didn't have the right documents or the rules change. It's an incredibly complicated process. And yet in some ways, the Chinese kind of cut through that process and made it simpler for people in Germany and Austria. Why was that? Why were the Chinese willing to some extent, pave the way for these Jewish refugees?
Well, I'm going to correct that or alter that that kind of phrasing, because although they went to China, it was not the Chinese mainly who allowed that to happen. Now, there was this Chinese diplomat that you're mentioning in Vienna who wrote out visas for people and made it much easier for those people to leave Germany and Austria in 38 and 39. And some of those people ended up in Shanghai. But Shanghai was not controlled by Chinese people in the 30s and had not been controlled by Chinese people for a long time. It was a site of international colonialism, really controlled by Western powers, the United States, Britain, France, Italy, others, as well as Japan. And the least known fact about the migration to Shanghai, the fact that so many Jews were rescued in Shanghai, the least known fact, I think, is that it's all due to the Japanese. The Japanese were not only partially controlled Shanghai, controlled a part of Shanghai in the late 30s, but they were much more willing to allow Jewish refugees to come to Shanghai than all of the Western powers. If it had been up to all of the Western powers who were represented in the Shanghai Municipal Council, migration to Shanghai of Jews would have stopped in December 1938 when about 1,500 had arrived. They wanted to stop it. And they got help from the State Department in Washington and the British Foreign Ministry. They were all interested in stopping this because they didn't want all these European Jews in Shanghai, which they were in at least partial control over. The Japanese allowed Jews to come to Shanghai all through 1939. Eventually, they also decided to make it more difficult. But by that time, about 18,000 people had come. And furthermore, these are people who I didn't interview, but there's a whole other wave of Jews who ended up in Shanghai, whom I met and talked to and did not include in my book. Polish and Lithuanian Jews who came across the Soviet Union and ended up in Japan, spent a year in Japan. The Japanese supported these Jewish refugees while the Nazis were killing them. And then they sent them to Shanghai. I decided not to include them in my book. It's a whole other community, and with a whole other history and really a whole other life in Shanghai. And so my book is not about it's not about Jews in Shanghai. It's about a particular group, of Jewish refugees in Shanghai. But I bring that up just because of the fact that the Japanese allowed all of these people to survive and killed nobody in all the time that they were in charge of Shanghai. It's why isn't that spoken about a lot? Because the Japanese, who speaks about how good they are? Everybody. That's how you find out who does the good things. But the Japanese are very reluctant to say anything about this because of the way they treated the Chinese in China, which I think could be called a genocide. And so, speaking of World War II and what the Japanese did in regards to allowing Jews in Shanghai is just kind of secretive among Japanese scholars. It's hard to find out. What's really hard to find out is who in the Japanese government made all these decisions to allow Jews to come, to argue against all the Western powers who wanted this to stop, to finally decide, well, we're going to make it more difficult after August 1939, to deal with all these Polish Jews in Kobe. Who was making all these decisions? What were the art? You can't find that out right now. Maybe someday, but that's really missing.
That's fascinating. That's just really interesting. And in terms of this confrontation of cultures, I mean, the Jews brought a lot of cultural baggage. I mean, in addition to their actual baggage, they brought their prejudices, their assumptions, their fears. As you listened to these interviews, did you feel like this was partly a story of people coming to terms with their prejudices? Do they overcome them? Is there a certain level of meeting of cultures between the Jews and the Chinese, or do you feel like ultimately it was kind of ships passing in the night, and they interacted a little bit, but avoided each other as well? I mean, how do you ultimately depict that kind of moment of cultural confrontation?
Warren, I'm glad you asked that question, because now that I've said something good about the Japanese, I want to say something about the Chinese. Although I don't think it's right to say the Chinese rescued all these Jews, it is right to say that the Chinese welcomed all these Jews. And thinking about it from the Chinese point of view, here come these really weird people who look just like the Westerners who have been persecuting and subordinating Chinese in Shanghai for a century. And yet the Chinese, and this is in the words, not in the words of, so I didn't interview Chinese, I interviewed Jews. But I asked them all, what was your relationship with Chinese? And every one of them, not just every one of the 12, but all the 100 said they welcomed us. They were kind to us. The Chinese in Shanghai had enormous problems. There were way more Chinese refugees in Shanghai than Jewish refugees. Chinese refugees from the Japanese war in the countryside pouring into Shanghai, hundreds of thousands. So there was tremendous poverty. And of course, Chinese cities were already beset by tremendous poverty. So there was poverty and persecution and distress among the Chinese people. And Jews recognized that. And Chinese people recognized Jews in distress. And there was, I think, a surprising attempt to mix with each other socially, in business, even though very few Jews learn Chinese. I think maybe the Chinese, well, Patty was saying Chinese have to learn English now. And I don't think it's just because the rules are different in China than in America. Chinese seem to be very good at languages, because many people told me about Chinese people they met who picked up Russian, German, a little Yiddish in order to get along with these Jews in just a few years. And some Jews learned Chinese. Those were especially young people who got jobs in Chinese firms and had to, but also were able to learn some Chinese. But as far as, so I think there's a lot of gaps in communication between Jews and Chinese, but nevertheless, their kids played together. They gave each other things. They helped each other when they could. And I think they both developed respect for the other people. And that's something that I've experienced when I go to China and I say I'm Jewish. Often people, and this includes academics, want to say something about what they think of Jewish people because it's nice. They think Jewish people are like them. Family, emphasis on family, emphasis on education, and a history of being subordinated and persecuted. A long history, people who go way back. So there is this sense on both sides. These people are very different, but we have something in common that we can bond over.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It seems like it was such a complicated environment too, because you not only had this moment of the Jews and the Chinese coming together, but you also had non-Jewish Germans. So you had actual Nazis there. You had, as you've mentioned before, the Americans, you had British, you had Russians, and then of course you had the Japanese. I mean, it just must have been such a complicated environment in which to do business, in which to raise your children. I mean, the relationship between the Jews and the Chinese is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's so many, and then the Jews themselves are divided, as you point out, between the Baghdadi Jews who are already there, the Russian Jews, and then the German Jewish refugees. I mean, that, how do you choose sides in a soccer team game? I mean, it just an incredible mix of peoples.
One of the things that I didn't have time to ask about, and that I think not many people have asked about, and so it's not written about very much, is the kind of relationships that the Jewish communities, Baghdadi, who were there first, Russian Jews, who were sort of refugees, they'd come out of the Soviet Union, and even from before, they'd come out of the Russian Empire and ended up in Shanghai, but were there already when these German and Austrian refugees came, and then the Polish-Lithuanian refugees. So there's 4 groups who all are different, really fundamentally different from each other. And like, well, what are the relationships? To really tease out what are the relations? And that involves asking people, well, what did you think about this group? And it's not a question that I asked. And it's not a question that other people have asked. And now it's almost too late to ask anybody. So we'll have to get hints. But I think it's very interesting. The most important relationship for the refugees was their relationship with the Baghdadi Jews, who had by far the most wealth, even though they were the smallest group, and who were incredibly generous, enabling the German refugees, German-speaking refugees, to have places to live, dormitories to live, food, and schooling. Mm. And they supported all that.
Pretty famous families, right? I mean, the Sassoons or the
Kaduris. Yes.
Yeah.
These are well-known. They were well-known families before that, and they really put their wealth and connections to good use for the refugees.
Yeah. We're starting to get some questions, and I'd like to encourage everybody now to start asking. I certainly have an endless number of questions I can ask Stephen, but we really do want to encourage participation from the audience. And actually, before I turn to some of the questions that have popped up, Stephen, I did want to ask a question that we'd gotten earlier. Yu Wang had asked how the stories of the refugees who ended up coming to the United States after 1945 were different from those who returned to Germany and Austria. Something you alluded to early on, but I think she wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, so as I said, I interviewed these two groups of people. I wasn't thinking about them at first as separate groups. I was just looking for people to interview. And wherever I was, I would find people to interview. I was teaching in Maine at that time, as you did, and there were no Jews from Shanghai in Maine, which isn't that surprising. But other places that I went to, I interviewed people. So I had these interviews in German of Jews who were back in Europe, and I had these interviews in America. And what I found out was that up to the point that they left Shanghai, their experiences in Europe, then their trip to Shanghai and their experiences in Shanghai, there really was no difference. They told the same, generally the same story, whether they ended up in America or ended up back in Germany or Austria. Where their stories then really became different was afterwards. The ones who I spoke to in America were almost all people that I would say were successful, came to America and had successful lives, got jobs, got good jobs, had raised families, and were happy. And they were happy with the freedom that they had in America. I'm sure that the selection of people who I eventually was able to interview don't necessarily represent everybody. That I'm sure that people who might have had unsuccessful lives in the United States, unhappy lives, would not have come to my attention, would not have volunteered themselves to be interviewed. Then the people that I interviewed in Germany and Austria really divided up into three groups. Again, I didn't know this was going to happen. The Austrians, the ones who went back to Austria, the ones who went back to what became West Germany, and the ones who went back to what became East Germany. The Austrians, I'm an Austrian. My grandparents were Austrian. My father was Austrian. My grandparents told me, and I didn't understand this when they said this, but I was young. They said the worst anti-Semites were the Austrians. They just said that. My grandparents had a lot of things that they said, but this became obvious then after 1945, when the Germans reluctantly, and in a way which I now find quite honorable, have admitted what they did and have tried to think about what that means, whereas the Austrians persisted for decades in saying we were victims too. So the Jews who went back to Austria, and almost all of them had been from Vienna, and so they went back to Vienna. They lived in an anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying country all the decades before I interviewed them, and they didn't like it. They were unhappy about that. Some of them were also quite successful, but they recognized and were unhappy about really about their choice to come back to Vienna rather than to have gone someplace else. The ones in West Germany had similar experiences. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in West Germany. There were a lot of former Nazis in the German government throughout most of the period of the West German government. And so there were problems, but they were mostly quite satisfied with having come to Germany and having made their life in Germany. They reconnected with people, and that's how they felt. So I'll just leave it at that. None of that is surprising. This was what was surprising to me. The ones who went back to East Germany, and all the ones that I spoke to lived in Berlin, East Berlin, were almost all had made that choice. They were almost all from socialist families, socialists before they left Germany, socialists sometimes secretly, sometimes openly in Shanghai, and then hoping to participate in the building of a socialist, free, and not anti-Semitic new Germany. Of course, by the time I spoke to them, after the reunification of Germany, it was quite obvious that their dreams for East Germany had not come about. And yet, as a group, those people were the happiest about where they had ended up, that their choice to be in East Germany. And they did not choose, after reunification, to go to West Germany. They stayed in East. They recognized the problems that had occurred. One of them, who I really got to like and who appears in the German version of my book, his father was arrested in East Germany and put in jail as part of an anti-Semitic wave throughout Eastern Europe in 1953. Still, this man that I spoke to was happier with his choice than, on average, the West Germans and certainly the Austrians.
Well, we have a question here from Linda, whose mother was in Shanghai, arrived in 1940, and she was wondering if at a certain time Jews needed affidavits to, I'm thinking afikomen, I don't see that word very often, affidavits to be admitted to Shanghai. Did they need affidavits? Not afikomen.
Up to August 1939, you needed nothing to, now it says my internet connection is unstable. I hope that I'm coming through here.
You look very stable to me.
Okay, you didn't even need to show your passport. When you landed in Shanghai, you didn't need to show a passport. You just landed. There were no passport controls at all. This was part of the fact that Shanghai was being contested between the Japanese and Westerners and Chinese. So you didn't need any papers. You needed papers often to get out of Germany and Austria. You needed some papers, not these visas that Dr. Feng Shangho gave out in Vienna. These were visas to China, but you didn't need them to get into China. They were very helpful, though, in getting out of Germany. After August 1939, when there were restrictions put on which refugees could come, and still a couple thousand were able to come, you didn't need an affidavit, but you needed some kind of documentation that you had a relative in Shanghai, that you had a job in Shanghai, or that you had some money. Money would, and not much money from our point of view, but money would buy you in to Shanghai, but never anything like an affidavit, which is what you needed. That word is the label of the document that you need to come to the United States.
Were there a lot of currencies in circulation in Shanghai, given the nature of things? I mean, your book makes a lot of reference to yuan, I think, but in fact, if you brought marks or dollars or whatever, were they all just kind of?
The people, the refugees who came to Shanghai, theoretically, at some point in their lives, they had a lot of European cash, but not when they got to Shanghai. It had all been taken away. So they were not bringing an infusion of European cash. Everybody ended up using Chinese money or dollars. If you could get your hands on dollars, that was a common currency in Shanghai, just as English was the language of official business, not official in the sense of government, but the language of business in Shanghai was English. So dollars were good and yuan were good. Inflation after the war was over was terrible. And this made enormous problems for everyone in Shanghai, not just the refugees.
We had another question from Zhao Ma. With regard to refugee experience, White Russians arrived in Shanghai before the Jews. Did you compare these two foreign refugee groups in terms of their experience in their newly adopted home city?
Well, the phrase White Russians is not about Jews. White Russians are called White Russians because they opposed the Red Soviet Revolution in 1917. And that was why many of them were in China and eventually ended up in Shanghai. So they left either during or right after the revolution as persecuted people, but quite conservative and usually anti-Semitic. Then there were all these Russian Jews, Russian and Polish Jews in Shanghai. And I think that's what the questioner is asking about. I interviewed a couple of them. I did not try to study them or figure out their lives. Their time in Shanghai began much earlier. Some of them arrived in Shanghai before the First World War, but most of them between the two world wars. They had a very different experience in Shanghai. They were not considered refugees by the Japanese. And so when the Japanese created in 1943 the designated area into which all refugees who had arrived after 1937 had to live, that didn't include these Russians who'd arrived there before. It also didn't include German and Austrian refugees who had arrived before 1937. And there were a couple of hundred of those. It only was these late coming refugees who had to move to the designated area, which is sometimes called a ghetto, a word that I don't like. Although the best way to understand that, what it meant to be in the designated area, is to compare it to the ghetto, the original ghetto in Venice, which was like this ghetto in Shanghai. You could live there, you could go outside, you just had to be back at night. Nothing like the World War II ghettos that the Nazis created, where most people were killed. So this brings up actually, I think, an interesting problem for historians. The people that I talk to, well, the word ghetto for the designated area is common. And it's common among the Jews who were there in Shanghai, whether they had to go to the ghetto or not. They call it the ghetto. They didn't know when they started thinking about the designated area as a ghetto, they didn't know what was going on in Warsaw or Łódź or any of those other ghettos. This was a ghetto like they had heard about in Jewish history. And so they like to use the word ghetto, and they continue to use the word ghetto. And when I say I think that can be misleading, then in a sense, I'm speaking against the eyewitnesses. I'm saying their use of language and description is not what I would use. Mm-hmm. So that's hard for a historian, for anyone to do, to say, no, I don't want to use your language. I'm not correcting it. I'm just substituting words that I think are better. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it's a moral issue for a historian, someone who's made friends with all these people.
Beverly wants to know what you are going to do with your taped materials.
Oh, my taped materials. So I am 72. For the first time in decades, last year, I had to move out of a college office. And that meant I had to get rid of things that I've been collecting for 40 years as a historian. And one of the things I have are tapes, and I'm very old fashioned. I have these cassette tapes of 100 interviews and pages and pages, folders for each person and everything. I really had to think about where I wanted all this stuff to go. And so a lot of it has gone to Bates College, where I started this project in Maine. They have the folders, they have tapes. I've also sent tapes and interview transcripts to some other Holocaust museums. There's one in Vancouver that has quite a collection. I've given some things to the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. And I haven't gotten rid of everything yet. So, but this is a life course issue for a historian. What do you do with all your stuff? I think it's worth saving. And other people now can use my interviews for purposes that I couldn't imagine. And I'm happy with that.
Zhao Ma was asking about the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum. And I have to say, I had never heard of the museum. So maybe you could say a couple things about it. And whether your specific question is, if you've noticed any change or revision in the museum's exhibits since it, I guess since it was established.
I don't think there are any other refugee museums. Can you think of a place that has a museum to people who were refugees there? I can't think of anything. So it's an amazing thing. It means that, as everything official that happens in China, it means that the Chinese government and even a bigger Chinese intellectual establishment thinks it's worthwhile and useful to have a museum in Shanghai dedicated to the experience of refugees. And the worthwhile part or parts, the story is interesting. It's really a Shanghai story. But it's also a good story. All these people came to Shanghai. They all would have been killed in Europe. They came to Shanghai. They survived. They got along with their Shanghai neighbors. And then eventually they left. And it's a good story about China, about how China welcomed Jews when they were being killed in Europe. There's another part of that story. It's the story of Jews in Kaifeng. The earliest Jewish community in China was in the capital of the Southern Dynasty, Kaifeng, after the 12th century. Jews came there. Nobody has quite figured out how, probably along the Silk Road, but where did they start? Jews arrived there and were welcomed and eventually became so assimilated into the Chinese population through intermarriage that their Jewishness almost disappeared by the 19th century. But this is another great story. Jews came to China. What were they doing? In Europe, the Crusaders were killing every Jew they could find. In China, these Jews assimilated. So the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum is part of this story about Chinese as more than tolerant, as welcoming of Jews. I have supported this museum since it was first created. I helped them write their English language text that goes with their exhibits. And I've helped them do that several times. It started in, I wish I had the date in my head and I can never remember it, but let's say the museum's about 15 years old. It started as just part of a former Jewish synagogue where some of the look of the synagogue is preserved. And then it's expanded into buildings behind it. This is all in the former designated area, so it's in the right spot. They show a lot of things that former refugees have given them: documents and artifacts and clothes, photographs. But they also have a narrative about the whole story. I'll say something about the most controversial, what I think of as the most controversial aspect of that narrative. How many refugees were there? I say in my book, all the American and Western scholars say in our books, it was about 18,000. But there are many Chinese scholars who say 30,000, 25,000. It's a better story if 30,000 were there than if 18,000 were there. So why not just add a few? The museum is kind of caught in the middle between Western scholars who they depend on and the Chinese environment, where they get some pressure from some Chinese academics to say 30,000. So far, they have said 18,000. And I've just heard that the new expansion, which just opened within the last year, has much more interactive and modern museum technology than what they used to have. They used to have static exhibits, which were very nice, but now you can do more interactive stuff.
I would have thought the most controversial part would be the role of the Japanese. I thought you were going to say that.
Well, there's nothing good about the Japanese in the Chinese exhibit, but there's nothing false either. So some people, I've heard people say, and there are stories around the internet, that there was barbed wire around the designated area, or that the Japanese brutalized Jews. And just none of that is true. And those stories do not appear in the exhibits. The way I interpreted Japanese behavior also does not appear in that exhibit. The Japanese are kind of off to the side. And the Chinese, as friends, neighbors, helpers, they appear prominently. But I think it's justified.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is such a complicated history in a way. I mean, I think you brought out the fact that they have to deal with a lot of complicated, and especially given that there's been no explanation of why the Japanese behaved in the way that they did and what exactly went into that. Makes it a difficult story to tell, I imagine. So Nancy Lee asks, how much freedom did the Jewish people have living in Shanghai since the city was divided by concessions compared to other Westerners and Chinese? And how much were Jewish people aware of their Jewishness when living in Shanghai? In other words, how did they identify themselves?
Okay, so those are really separate questions. I'll try to do both of them. Until the designated area was created in 1943, there were no restrictions on the movement of Jews, these refugees, in Shanghai. There were no restrictions on really anyone's movement in Shanghai, except the restrictions that come from your financial situation. And the financial situation of refugees was so disastrous because the Germans stripped them of absolutely everything before sending them off or letting them leave, that they tended to live in the cheapest place, which was Hangzhou, which became the designated area. Most Jews lived there because that was the only place they could afford a family in a room. And if they had a family in a room, if they had a room to themselves, that was pretty good. Then in 1943, the Japanese created this designated area, which lasted until the end of the war. Jews, all the refugees since 1937 had to be there. So the ones who had been living in better places than Hangzhou had to move there. And then you could only go out with a pass. And you had to get a pass. The way to get a pass was to go to a Japanese authority and explain why you needed a pass for one day to go into downtown Shanghai, or every day for a week, or every day for as long as because you had a job there. Some people could get, most people got passes. That's a whole other story about the difficulties. But I think the most important fact is people could get passes and go. But that was much more difficult. And a lot of the people who were living in the designated area never left it for the 2 years it was in existence. They didn't want to try to get a pass. It was difficult, and they didn't really have any good reasons. And so they stayed there and developed that area, which had been in terrible shape from the fighting between the Chinese and the Japanese in 1937, really was partly a bombed out slum. They developed it as much as they could. They built restaurants, they built stores, they built buildings, and they created a real life, which some people could not participate in because they had no resources at all, and which other people could participate in. One other thing I want to say, one of the free things that everybody could avail themselves of was the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association school, which was called the Kadoorie School because that family funded it. And that was a regular Jewish secular school run by German Jews, run by refugees, that educated thousands of refugee children for nothing. There were fees, but you didn't have to pay them to go there. And so that was a real center of the community. I've gotten very interested in that school. Many of the people that I interviewed had gone there and they told me about it. And they all had pretty glowing descriptions of the school and its atmosphere and its teachers and its principal. And so I decided to do a little more research. I think it's a notable creation. You had asked earlier about German Jewish culture in Shanghai. This was an example of German Jewish culture. How to create a school, what to teach your kids, teach them some Jewish religion, teach them some science and math, teach them some German or English, teach them physical education. It was a real German Jewish school, very successful one, and an interesting place of cultural creation for these Jews. That's the analog or the thing beside it is German culture, plays and music, literature, theater. That and the two intermingled because a lot of productions were produced at the school, and a lot of religious services were held at the school. So the school was really a central point for the whole refugee culture, what they were able to develop in just a few years.
Sounds like you've got the topic for your next book.
Well, I don't know what my next book is. You know, I'll say something about my next book because I wanted to do this.
Well, we have to wrap up. So
okay, then we're done.
I'm gonna let you close with that, but I just want to be sure and thank everybody. And I'll apologize that I couldn't get to everybody's questions, but thank you all for being out there. And why don't we let Stephen have the last word, and then I know that Patty's got some comments for everyone too. So.
Oh, the last word is about an essay that someone wrote. This is Gabrielle Abram. She wrote an essay in this book, which is another book that I put together, but this is a book of essays, A Century of Jewish Life. And the essay that she wrote argues that Shanghai refugees are Holocaust survivors. And that is an interesting question, which it was never clear whether refugees were considered as survivors, like a Buchenwald survivor, an Auschwitz survivor, a hidden child. It's all very different experiences. And many of the refugees, one of the reasons why the story that I'm most interested in, these Jewish refugees in Shanghai, didn't really get, I said it didn't really get told until the 1990s, is that these former refugees did not consider themselves to be Holocaust survivors like those survivors who survived in Europe, and thought maybe they shouldn't talk about their problems and their troubles because that was nothing like what happened to someone who survived a camp. And so they were reluctant to talk about it. And it means we've had less chance to interview the older people who were in Shanghai. Thank you for listening to me, to us. Thank you, Patty, for organizing this. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Hochstadt and Professor Rosenbaum. This is a very insightful discussion session. And like Professor Rosenbaum said, it is a complex history. But I think it's important for us to keep the memory of Holocaust alive. Among the horrible things people experienced, we also see through Steve's book incredible survivor stories, resilience, compassion, and humanity. Like one of the participants typed in the Q&A box, she appreciated very much all the help she got from the people in local Shanghai. So these are the things which will keep us hopeful for a better world to come, and keep us to ponder around, the good things around us. Okay, thanks again, all the participants. And if you visit Shanghai, do check out the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum. And if you mention Steve Hochstadt, they may give you a free pass, right? So, and also you're welcome to join us on March 10th for our third author talk. Dr. Anthony Clark will be talking on his book, China Gothic, the Bishop of Beijing and his Cathedral. My good friend, Dr. Joseph Lee, history professor at Pace University, will moderate that talk. All right, so hope everybody have a nice weekend. Stay warm and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you, Stephen. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.